Lee Hall was an adjunct professor at Rutgers on immigration and animal law, taught at Widener University in Delaware, specializing in environmental law, attempted to stop killing of deer in Valley Forge National Park, did a writing project for the UN Encyclopedia of Sustainability, became a vegan in 1983 after attending a rock concert in London. She found a leaflet left on chairs. She looked around. She saw someone with a backpack. Very first person she ever met that was a vegan. And this person who was putting these leaflets on was explaining everything about the reasons for becoming a vegan, about the terrible pain and suffering that animals go through, etc., etc. And that was 1983 in London, England. And Lee became a vegan at that point. Lee's latest book is entitled On Their Own Terms, Animal Liberation for the 21st Century. Having said that, I would like to bring up the first speaker. Please give a very, very warm welcome for Lee Hall.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, everyone. And where's Nadine Lafond? That was so superb.
Yes.
Thank you. Come back, I hope. And American Vegan Society for finding Nadine Lafond. Well done. Mm-hmm. It's been wonderful listening to this music. And enjoying all the beautiful food from Wildflower and Self-Love. Thank you. And Christina Martin, Chef Christina Martin is here. Thank you. And thanks to the volunteers and to the American Vegan Society and everybody who is here supporting this day, regardless of what the weather forecast originally was. This is, the name of the presentation, as you probably already know, is Why Vegan? Let Me Count the Ways. Vegan for your health, for healing the environment, for fair food sources, and for animal liberation. And I have, we could call those 4 pillars, or we could call those 4 threads. How many for pillars? How many for threads? I think we got a few more threads. All right, I'll go with the threads theme. So the weaving of the 4 threads of why vegan and the ways that I have counted is something that I would do in my classwork. So if I were doing animal law, I would bring in the point of being veganism and how it connects to animal law. So if I was doing environmental law, developing a course, I would make sure that I put in the connection between what we do in our lives every day and our eating habits and what we're trying to do for the environment in legal ways. So that was, and you might notice that Beretta said I was an adjunct professor. And that's in fact the case. I'd just like to tell you something about the academic world because I think it is really relevant to every one of us here. It turns out that when statistics are looked at as far as people and their views on climate change and their views on emissions and whether climate change exists and whether we should do something about it, there's a correlation with education. So because of that, our entire environment, our future, our hope of integrating humanity into a biocommunity with respect has a connection to people's appreciation for and support for education. And what I have seen, and why I'm no longer teaching, is the schools, and I have to include the one that I've most recently taught at, and that's Widener. By the way, Widener is the only law school in Delaware, so this is even more significant to tell you this, that I was told, no, there would be no chance of full-time. And in fact, the dean was offering buyouts for the tenure and tenure-track faculty who existed still. In other words, you're talking about a law school who is going to hire people for instructional staff who they're not going to make any long-term commitment to. In fact, they don't know from term to term whether they'll be teaching. And there's a term that has arisen called the new faculty majority. And what the majority is people who are not, they have no benefits, and there's no committed future. And so it is made up of part-time and adjunct instructional staff. And that is the majority of the faculty across the board now in the United States. So you are talking about from community colleges, universities, and grad schools, and I'm seeing it's happening in law schools. This is the way things are going, to the extent that the American Association of University Professors most recently put the figure at 76% part-time and adjunct. 76%. So, but you can't keep a good vegan down. And so I'm extra thankful to the American Vegan Society, because the American Vegan Society has a speakers bureau, and this is one example of the educational work that can be done. There are workarounds. So without institutional support, I'm an indie author and have come out with a book that I think weaves the four threads together. And I have found ways that educators are being supported through crowdfunding. There's a new thing now on the internet where people come together and they actually fund things that that they believe in need to be done. It may even be $1 a month, and people chip in and they crowdfund for, in my case, some educational outreach every month. Some example of educational outreach every month. So thank you to the American Vegan Society for being one of the educational providers in our society. The first one was health. So when we're talking about health as the first thread, I'm looking at a jackfruit and chickpeas and wildflower, the beautiful salads. You're my favorite salad in the world. And so the healthful offerings that, hi Vinny, that you do with love as the first ingredient. So health. The term self-love I really, really like for veganism, self-love, because it's impossible, and you've written this out on the truck, it's impossible to extend profound respect to others without self-respect. So it starts with self-love, and then, as you say, Vinny and Christy, as you say, it also works the other way. Once you respect others is when you truly, authentically respect yourself. So the question becomes, what are we doing as far as cultivating care for the one body that's ours? And that doesn't mean we're in perfect physical shape, without any questionable habits or indulgences. But I think that it does mean a journey to the interior of the self. So, for example, if we have been struggling with addictions, and I will admit to being one who has, we are looking for the causes of self-harm. So when we do this journey into the interior, we tend to find out that there is trauma deep in the background of this struggle to care, to let go of things that weren't good for us, and to start craving the things that are actually good for us. And so wildflower and self-love, thank you, because you're making these healthful foods so attractive and easy to crave. We on this continent mainly came here as children of migrant families. Many of us were either pressed here or forced here in some form of diaspora. Diaspora being the dispersal of people from their homelands. And without even sometimes knowing what our ancestral history was. And to give you an example of something that surprised me, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia, and I would hike along the railways. Now this shouldn't have surprised me because I taught immigration law and I knew the history of the Chinese railway workers in California and how that became the beginning of immigration law. Immigration law is really anti-immigration law. It was a way to stop people from coming in, and that began with, a big part of it, the immigration law began with the Chinese workers. So on the railroad. So then I heard that where I hiked along the railroad, there's a mass grave, and there were the Irish workers buried there. And so I did some studying into the Irish workers who were buried at the railroads, and it turns out there are quite a few mass graves. And there was a mass grave in the Northeast that I read about, and it had my family name on it, and it had been, the bodies were underneath an actual cemetery. So there was a hidden mass grave underneath a cemetery. And it turns out that some people in a school excavated, and they found out that this is the bodies of Irish railway workers. So we all have a story that we may only partially know. And I think it's important to put this together with making changes that are healthful for ourselves. And when we look at veganism, we, as vegans or aspiring vegans or pro-vegans or vegan-curious people, we go to the definition and we find out what was going on when the vegans created this movement. And they were doing it in one very big sense to heal. Because they said, they used the word wholesome. And I've heard people say, oh, if somebody's vegan for your health, it's not really a vegan. Because if you're really vegan, you do it for the animals. So they're not so committed. But then when I turned to the definition, which was fully formed by 1951 by the Vegan Society in England, it says that the vegan diet is derived entirely from, and I quote, fruits, nuts, vegetables, grains, and other wholesome non-animal products, and excludes flesh, fish, fowl, eggs, honey, and animal milk and its derivatives. So why were they doing this? Why were they deciding what could and could not be in the diet? They were doing it because it was a principle applied to diet. And they said, for example, if the vegan principle, so they're not saying it's a diet, they're not saying veganism was a diet. They're saying that the diet flows from a principle. And there's a difference there. And for example, if the vegan principle is applied to diet, it can be at once seen why it must be vegetarian in the strictest sense, and why it cannot contain any foods derived from animals. Now they go to explain the difference between the vegetarian and the vegans who they set out to become. They said, one may be a vegetarian for a variety of reasons: humanitarian, health, or a mere preference for such a diet. The principle is a matter of personal feeling and varies accordingly. Veganism, however, is a principle that man has no, and they're writing in the language of 1951, so they said that man has no right to exploit the creatures for his own ends. There's the principle, and no variation occurs. Imagine a non-exploitative society where no one, regardless of human or non-human, was exploited. Imagine if we loved ourselves that much, that we could love each other that much. And it reminds me of something that I read that Mary Lawrence said. And Mary's here, so Mary, if you want to stand up and so people know who this is who said this, because it's so beautiful and so to the point. Tell people you're plant-based if you want them to know you changed your diet. Tell them you're vegan if you want them to know you intend to change the system. So the second thread is for the environment, and I'm not going to cite a lot of studies, maybe two. And this one is 2014, and it was in the Journal of Climatic Change by Peter Scarborough, University of Oxford. Scarborough and the colleagues there collected data on the true diets of more than 50,000. I think it was closer to 60,000. Vegan people who self-identified as vegans, vegetarians, fish eaters, and meat eaters. And it turned out, the study showed that the difference with greenhouse gases between the average meat-focused eater and the average vegan eater, the difference in greenhouse gases was 2.5 times over for the flesh-focused diet. It was 2.5 times as much greenhouse gases. Wow! Right there, say no more, right? That's it. How can we not care about the climate, realize what this is doing, and decide to transform ourselves? Of course, people in the environmental community, and I met them when I got my second law degree in environmentalism, they would say, well, buy local. It's not, you don't have to, or they would say, I don't have to make that switch because I live there's chickens next door, and I just get the local eggs. Hi, Gail. I just saw you. And it turns out that, and this is the second out of two studies, this is it for the studies, Christopher Weber and Scott Matthews, they're environmental engineering professors at Carnegie Mellon. So they did a study on the reduction of greenhouse gases if you were to be a locavore. So this is local all the time. Who does this? I mean, nobody really does this, right? Go locavore all the time, every day. But they found out that even if you did only local food every day, your max in terms of reducing your greenhouse gases could only be about 4 or 5%. That's not really a big deal. And so why is this? Well, it turns out that, say those folks next door with those chickens, the local eggs, they drive to the feed store. Okay, so it's feed. They drive to the feed store. The feed comes from Canada or the Midwest. And then it has to go somewhere to be aggregated, bagged. And then it has to be trucked to the retail shop. So put this all together, and you see how it goes? When people give you the locavore argument, make sure you bring up the feed. The third threat. Oh, one more thing before that. I came up with this concept which belongs to all of us, I think. Because once we know this, we look at the folks who do the divestment. Like I think Harvard and there are a number of universities who are trying to press their universities to divest from fossil fuels. So take Exxon and Shell and the fossil fuels out of our portfolios. We don't want the university involved in it, right? So there's a movement to divest. And I think our movement would be called dietary divestment. And I think we have a real case for a campaign in dietary divestment, the diet, and divesting from the climate change effects that people have when they continue to support animal agribusiness companies. Okay, so the third thread is vegan for fair food sources. And I'll go fair trade. I love fair trade. I love the symbols. If I get a package of coffee or tea or chocolate, so I always got to have a fair trade. And I won't buy it if I don't have the extra money to afford it. I will not buy it because I'm not going to buy slavery chocolate, right? or coffee or tea, right? And slavery, chocolate is, most of the cheap chocolate is slavery. And these companies know it. And there's kids enslaved in the Ivory Coast. These companies know it, and they're some of the wealthiest families in the United States. So nothing's worth that. I mean, I will forego chocolate if that's all there is. But when I see chocolate and it says fair trade and there's animal products in it, then I'm thinking, how fair is it really? So, I mean, how can we expand the idea, and that's another campaign, right? How can we expand the idea of fair trade so that everyone's treated fairly who can feel, who has a life experience on Earth, right? If we are serious about addressing hunger as well, and that's a huge fairness issue around the world, world hunger, I think it's a fourth of the people go to bed hungry. It's a real issue. And the vegan diet would make the most sense. We have all heard forever, right? It's well known that the 1 acre of land can support on the average about 10 times the value in protein if you're doing beans and vegetables on it as opposed to grazing. And there's a statistic that the grains we grow in the US, 70% of them go to what? Feed, not food for people. And several countries in the global south are giving up huge amounts of land to grow soybeans to send to animal agribusiness in the wealthier countries. So that's the issue of not just the Amazon rainforest, but many valuable ecosystems throughout the world. Egypt is a particularly illustrative case. In Egypt, for 25 years, encouraged by the U.S. Agency for International Development, also called USAID. And think about that this is called USAID when we look at what happened here for 25 years. They invested, the Egyptian government invested heavily in animal agribusiness, and they got to the point where they grew more feed than food. Winners in this cycle were the big U.S. companies such as Cargill, which runs about half the world's grain market. So we see that poor farmers were really harmed, not helped. And when you convince financially, I shouldn't say poor, but financially poor, because who's poor is not for any of us to judge, right? How poor somebody feels. But financially poor is a fact, right? So they'll be getting involved in switching to feed markets because it's lucrative, right? And then they will have to depend on the annual purchase of patented seeds from particular companies. They get in a cycle where then they become beholden to a particular company to buy their seeds. Monsanto has genetically altered vegetables so that they will become resistant to the company's own weed-killing product. Roundup may poison the fishes, earthworms, spiders and mites and beetles, and also increase the risk to farm workers. People will say, oh, why do I need to buy fair trade bananas or whatever? You know, there's a big husk here. It's not one of the dirty dozen or whatever. What about the workers, right? So environmental toxins from modified crops then go into the soil. The crops themselves become toxic into the soil, and then they threaten the earthworms that have to be there and aerate the soil. So a growing movement believes there are better ways to interact with the earth and the other animals who inhabit it. And it actually comes out of the vegan community. The name of this subgroup, or I guess we all probably support it, is Vegan Organics. All right, so the Vegan Organic Network started in England, and offshoots of the, and I'm not going to go into this because Harold knows so much about it and it comes next. Then the question is, so if people show us how to do schoolyard gardens, right, and if they show us how to do community gardens and so forth, and they show us how to, the big thing is, can we really get away from the animal manure, right? Okay, so you've gone organic, but is it vegan organic? Did you get away from the animal inputs? And the answer is yes. And I'll give two examples. One is in Guatemala, and Honduran and Guatemalan farmers. There were 45,000 in this group of farmers that used mucuna beans as cover for hillside soil. And in fact, they came up with 3 times the amount of corn that they had before they did the green manure. So that was a very big project, and it worked out very well. Then there was a project of 200,000 Brazilian farmers, and they used plant-based manures, and they doubled their wheat and their corn yields. So it can work. Vegan for Animal Liberation is the 4th thread, and I'm just going to throw in a surprise thread at the end. But when we're talking about animal liberation, now I told you about the crowdfunding, right? So there are people who are on my studio, and it's a site called Patreon. There are people who are funding, but they're also participating, right? So they want me to go out and do these talks, so I said, well, you need to be involved in this too. So cough it up. Tell me what your reason is for being vegan, because I want you to be part of this. And I heard back from Vance Lemkel of Philadelphia. Okay? And Vance said, well, I can't claim it's for the animals, since I don't know which animal out there will actually ever benefit from my lifestyle. I'll get back to that in a minute, because that's profound. Okay? But for me, Vance said, the reason is self-identity. In the early 80s, I felt a dissonance between who I felt that I was or could be and who I was being by continuing to do something that I felt was wrong. So for Vance, it's not that the expanding ranges of vegan products, it's not that we have facts to share, it's to Vance, and Vance says this is the key reason that people who eat animal products do too. It's self-identity. So it's an identity for somebody who encounters a possibility, they can identify with it. Well, how do they identify with it? There are people who are samples. Beretta and I were talking about this. People who are samples, leading the way, and they showed Beretta, oh yes, I could, this is how I could identify, because I don't want the dissonance of doing something wrong. You even used the terminology like Vance used, and then you said who it was. And it was Jay Dinshaw and Freya Dinshaw. So you had the samples, and you said, scientific proof.
That's right.
So we are all, those of us who are aspiring vegans or have been vegan for a while, we become walking proof that there's a basic human capacity to live vegan, which is a pretty cool role that we play. Vance's comment said something about dissonance between who we can be and continuing to do something that we felt was wrong. So that brings me back to 1983. Beretta went into it. I was at a rock concert and I met somebody. I didn't go and watch the band. I listened to, we had a conversation because this person put leaflets on all the chairs, and I wanted to figure out what this person was about. Who would put leaflets on all the chairs? You would really have to care about something very deeply, and I wanted to know why. And when it was explained to me how all the different ways we use animals, because the holidays were coming up, so it was going to be a goose on the table, and it was going to be furs from one spouse to another, and it was going to be puppies who were bought as though they were commodities, and maybe left in the back for after they grew up, and all sorts of things that I remember back in my childhood seeing or somehow experiencing or participating in. And here was my dissonance. I couldn't see myself as part of a master class because that would contradict my feminism. And to me, feminism is defined as rejecting a dominator mentality. That's all it is. Rejecting a dominator mentality. So how could I be part of this class who dominates all the others? Is there really a way out of this? Is there a way to reject this? And Robin, who was my example, said, yes, let me show you, however long it takes. You ask me questions, I'll be here. Wow. So Vance says, I'm talking about this on the website, and Vance comes back and says, wow, I became a feminist about the same time you became a vegan. When I learned the basic facts about patriarchal systems, the injustice was clear and not something I wanted to be supporting. Given the fair-minded individual I thought I was, once I learned about male privilege, so often conveniently invisible to those who profit by it, it made it easier for me then to examine how else I might be benefiting from privilege. And it was clear that my relationship to non-human animals was a similar unjust privilege needing to be redressed. And at that time, I did not have or know all the facts about dairy that made it so clear, the ties between feminism and dairy, but those I received at the North American Vegetarian Summerfest, and then I went vegan. The other thing, going back to the first thing about, I don't know any animal who would benefit from my lifestyle, which at first might sound funny because you might think, well, there's a lot, right? But no, what Vance did was significant. Vance removed heroism from the picture and stepped back. Vance wasn't going to sense veganism as a rescue. Okay? Vance was not going to be a hero. And then now you go back to the 1951 definition, and it resonates with that. It says, in a vegan world, notice the absence of heroism here, or rescue. In a vegan world, the creatures would be reintegrated within the balance and sanity of nature. A great and historic wrong whose effect on the course of evolution must have been stupendous would be righted. And here's the real zinger. The idea that his fellow creatures might be used for man for self-interested purposes would be so alien to human thought as to be almost unthinkable. Okay, so you wouldn't think these animals benefited because you wouldn't have thought to exploit them. You wouldn't be in the position of saying you're doing such a great thing for anyone because you wouldn't have exploited them. Wow. So in the definition it says, in this light, veganism is not so much welfare as liberation for the creatures and for our own minds and hearts. Not so much for an effort to make the present relationship bearable as an uncompromising recognition that because it is in the main one of master and slave, it has to be abolished before something better and finer can be built. And I'd like to add a fifth thread that I was thinking about as I was preparing to come here, and that's for the community. Beretta, your bio, it says that you're the only vegan in your family.
That's correct.
I hope we can say that we're all here for you and for each other. I hope we can say we can all strive to empathize with each other. I hope we can say that we can provide each other a family. I think that's very important to say because in the vegan community, keeping a vegan organization going is very difficult. So the support and the caring among the people who come to events like this, particularly when it was going to be thunderstorming. I mean, I'm not saying you should be considering yourself a hero, because Vance wouldn't want that, but you are doing a great thing. So it's just, there can be competition, there can be little groups jostling for the prime space in the activism world, and so we need to think about this. We're committed to a great cause. We're going to see friction. Filmmaker James Levesque once told me, a commitment to a great cause is a solid foundation to build our inner lives upon, and also one virtually guaranteed to bring turbulence into the course of our lives. One thing that would help, I think, not just manage our tension, but also relieve it, would be safety. The refuge of knowing that when we speak out or we walk away from a situation based on principle, we won't lose the ability to keep a roof over our heads. So the fifth thread is the importance of treating each other as family. So we know that we have other vegans in our family because vegans are our family. And the more identifiable vegan spaces, and so we are here today, the American Vegan Society, identifiable vegan space, the more that we can make these work, the more opportunities vegans will find to have surroundings that celebrate our veganism, that offer us family, that sustain us not just producers in the world, but as vegans. And so vegan enterprise, not just what companies that make vegan products, but vegan-run enterprises matter. Supporting vegan-run enterprises matter. Let's just do a quick sample, okay? Let's say it's a house cleaning business, okay? And so it's started by a vegan. And the benefits for the success of this business are several. The vegan-run enterprise, we could also say, Wildflower Vegan Cafe is a sample. Okay, a vegan-run enterprise will seek ways to avoid toxic chemicals because they're tested on animals, because they're harsh on the environment and unhelpful for beings inside the building. Okay, as a vegan-run undertaking succeeds, it can make increasingly stronger decisions on fair trade and compensation for work. But it needs to have the support of the community to get there. The entity possibly could sustain one or more vegans in a supportive work environment where mutual support and even cooperative work relationships could flourish. We live in a critical time. We're just weighed down by humanity's sheer mass and our human addiction for domesticating other life, and people's addiction like consumerism. The biosphere now faces climate crisis. It faces an ever-worsening extinction period. So many vegans know this, but are financially forced to work in places where authentic respect is sidelined, or else they face financial failure. So support for vegan-run work and the vegan groups that identify as those who will keep changing the system is essential to strengthen us, to enable thought and advocacy from our ever-growing community of vegans. And I'm going to close this with another quote from the crowdfunded website. And this comes from a vegan in Western New York whose name is Maureen Sheener, who says, kind of an uplifting note, it's so easy being vegan these days. When I first became vegetarian many years ago, we had to make our own tofu burgers. There was no manufactured soy or milk or soy cheese. And forget about eating out. Forget about eating out. And now, of course, the mainstream supermarkets and the restaurants. So Maureen says there are a gazillion vegan cookbooks covering every angle of veganism. Plus, support groups abound on Facebook. Get with it. Vegan is the way to go. And I said, okay, thank you, Maureen, for being part of the garden party and our movement. Great point about social dining, social media, social support among vegans, and why there has never been a better time to join the vegans than now. Thank you.